Hi, welcome back to the exchange here at Cool and Candid. We're going to have a conversation today that follows on what we were talking about last week in terms of criminal justice reform. I'm going to turn it over to Chris Lund as our moderator for today.
Thank you, Ben. So again, we're talking about mass incarceration as kind of a subset of the criminal justice conversation. The question that we're going to start with is, how should we think about mass incarceration? So if you're not familiar with the idea of mass incarceration, roughly stated, the idea is that the United States incarcerates or puts more people in prison and jail than any other nation on earth, or really in history. One statistic that helps frame the conversation is while the United States makes up 10% of the world's population, we incarcerate 25% of the 25% of people in prison are in American prisons. So we're going to have kind of two opposing sides. Nikhil will state his kind of where he's coming from, what he thinks the problem is, and then we'll get into some solutions. So Nikhil, do you want to introduce yourself and then maybe start with where you're coming at on how we should...
Great to be back, folks. As always, I'm Nikhil. It's good to see everyone again. Thanks for having me, Ben. I think that specifically what we're going to be focusing on, or what I'd like to focus on in this segment, is whether or not there's a racial issue or racial disparity in the mass incarceration system. Acknowledging that, I think we incarcerate too many people, and that, the statistic that Chris presented is really representative of that. And I think that with the mass incarceration question and the issue as a whole, basically one of the points that people make saying that mass incarceration isn't this huge injustice or isn't this huge systemic problem is that if you look at actually crime rates and crime statistics, they sort of match the incarceration statistics, especially amongst minorities. And sort of, if we're trying to punish people for what they're doing wrong, then the system is actually working. My point is sort of that when we think about crime in that fashion, what we end up ignoring is the importance of education, of historic racial disparities in redlining policies, and basically a lack of economic opportunity for a lot of these minority communities. I think if you look at areas where there's high crime rates, the commonality isn't so much race or something along those lines, but poverty. And poverty also happens to be correlated with race. And so the issue, from my perspective here, is that we've created a system where a lot of people don't have opportunity and don't have economic opportunity, and because of that, they turn to crime and to extremism. And the mass incarceration system actually plays into that cycle by putting people away, locking them up, and creating situations where once they get out, or even if they get out, they're almost no ability to re-enter the workforce and re-engage with society in a productive way. Basically creating and perpetuating these cycles of incarceration and crime, incarceration and crime.
Awesome, thank you. And then Ben, do you want to just tell us where you're coming from? How do you think we should think about the problem of mass incarceration, or is it a problem that we need to be addressing at all?
Sure, thanks. I'm Ben Peterson. I'm a graduate student in political science, and I do think that the stats that you pointed to at the beginning, Chris, that we have very high incarceration rates in this country. We imprison more people per capita than I believe any other country. So I think it's a problem. Where I would challenge the sort of narrative that's often described is that mass incarceration is the great injustice of our time. It's the new Jim Crow, as I think Michelle Alexander's book argues, and others, and I've heard Brian Stevenson, who's a speaker who's really pointing to this. That's where I would challenge, I think, that narrative. In other words, I would point to that incarceration is not something that simply happens to a person. We have very high incarceration rates, but as, again, I've drawn a lot from Heather McDonald's work on this, we also have pretty high crime rates relative to other, for instance, Western European nations. And so that is at least partially to what explains, or perhaps the reason we have higher incarceration rates. And so also, as we've already, as Nikhil I think mentioned, those crime rates also fall disproportionately along racial lines. In other words, yes, I believe that Black Americans make up 40% of the incarcerated population and only 13% of the population at large. So there's obviously a disproportionate representation there. But again, and I don't remember the specific numbers on this, but also there's disproportionate representation of minorities in terms of crime suspects and then and the people convicted of crimes as well. So I do think mass incarceration is a problem, but I think it's even more complex than a lot of people make it out to be. And one other point I would make about this, I think there's a narrative out there that draconian sentencing for pretty minor crimes is what's really driving mass incarceration. Simple drug possession, other minor crimes, and I don't think that's the case. This is 54% of the state prison population, I believe, in the across the states are in for violent crime, are incarcerated for violent crimes, and the state prison population makes up the majority of the prison population in the country. I think 87%. And so that again, I would say yes, we should creatively try to find out how we can limit the prison population. I know that there's overcrowding in prisons, and also it's bad for public safety because when prison is not a place where people tend to, I think, develop good habits and prepare to be productive members of society by and large. So I do think it's a problem. I think it's even more complex, I think, than it's often made out to be, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Nikhil, do you want to respond maybe to Ben's point about
about violent crime specifically? Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's something that I would like to investigate the statistics behind a little bit more, especially looking at the overlap between violent crime and drug offenses. Because I think that the point that that Ben makes is really important. That if it is that the majority of people in prisons are there for serious violent crimes like homicide or murder or something like that, then maybe this isn't such a big problem or as big of a problem as we think it is. But on the other hand, if the majority of the people who are there because they made a mistake when they were younger, or they did something stupid, or they kind of ended up being a repeat offender through a series of decisions that kind of are forced upon them because of their situation that they are in, then that's a more systemic structural issue. And so I think that that's an area that we need to look at more and probably need better and more accurate research about to come to a conclusive conclusion, really. I think that one thing I would push back on and say is, again, why is it that the violent crime rate is so high? And I think, again, that the violent crime rate is so high because of a lack of economic opportunity, where, there's this concept that's been talked up a lot about called the school-to-prison pipeline. Basically, this concept that minor offenses in school, from missing class on a day for a small reason, leads to suspension, leads to another thing going wrong, leads to another thing going wrong, and eventually that kid ends up going to prison because there's no way for him to get back onto a more correct path. And I think that there's a lot of systems in that way that kind of don't provide economic opportunity to a lot of impoverished minority families and push them towards drugs and gangs as a way of making ends meet and surviving in their communities. And because of that, they get indoctrinated into this culture of violence from a very early age and then play into the violent crime statistics, basically.
Mm-hmm. So Ben, do you want to respond, or maybe you could, one question I have for you is, do you think that there's any is it appropriate to consider poverty, unemployment, not as quality of education in some of these urban spaces? How do we think about those things in terms of mass incarceration? So, is it important for us to just focus on those issues, poverty, unemployment, education, as the way to deal with mass incarceration, or is there maybe another way to think about solving this problem?
Yeah, I do think that those are relevant. In other words, the big, so if Nikhil is kind of saying, yeah, I see your point, and the problem, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, Nikhil, but tell me if I'm getting this right. In other words, yeah, okay, but why do people commit crimes in the first place? If people, let's agree, if we say, okay, the problem with mass incarceration is at least partially a crime problem. So then why do people commit crimes? Yeah, I think that's very appropriate. I don't know that I don't know that I know the answer. I don't know that it's quite the association of the clear association between poverty, lack of education, and crime. Although that would make sense intuitively to me. I'd like to look more on the data on that. I'm not quite sure on that. So
just to interject really quickly to clarify something and perhaps focus it more narrowly, just so that we don't start talking about these huge economic injustices, because that would just get us kind of off track a little bit. But I specifically think that in this context, discussing mass incarceration is really important, because I think that mass incarceration actually plays a huge role in perpetuating the cycles of poverty, lack of education, and lack of economic opportunity. And I'd love your perspective on that.
Sure. I do agree that, again, like I said earlier, if you getting into the prison system is a very terrible thing, and it probably I absolutely agree that it probably hurts communities because it's much harder to get work after you've been in prison. You come back, and a lot of people who are in prison, I believe, are repeat offenders. And so you get into a cycle. I absolutely believe that. I'm not sure, and we may be moving into the next discussion, Chris, on sort of solutions, but I'm not quite sure what the solution is. In other words, my understanding is that schools that are under-resourced or that have low income thresholds, low average incomes, whose families attend there or whose children attend there, they already have access to additional federal funding. So in other words, is this a problem that we can simply throw money at the school level and expect to see a difference? I'm not so sure.
I would absolutely agree with you about that as well.
Yeah. The other question I have is I'm really intrigued actually by this concept of the school to prison pipeline. I'd like to see more data on that because, for instance, there was a lot of I saw some data that we looked at from I think the ACLU about disparate demerits in schools falling on racial lines and things like that. What I didn't see really clearly, there was one stat I saw that in California prisons, I think 70% of inmates I think I'm getting this right. 70% of inmates had been in the foster care system.
Yeah.
At one point. So, but I think to prove the sort of prison to school pipeline thing, we would need a stat school to prison pipeline. We would need a stat like that, right? How many people who are in prisons came from from schools or were in school systems that were of a certain underprivileged background or something like that? I haven't seen quite that data. The other and I guess the overall point I do want to make is, yes, I think those are relevant. I don't think it's quite. I still think it's very complicated, and I don't see a clear cut. I don't think we should necessarily stop incarcerating people particularly for violent and property theft crimes and things like that, and then think that we'll just simply solve the problem by throwing more money at under-resourced communities. I think.
And just to respond really quickly to that, I absolutely agree with you. And this is like a huge multi-layered problem with like circles on circles on circles of feedback loops and so on. But I think that what we do need to address in terms of the mass incarceration issue is that the focus or the emphasis on the mass incarceration system needs to be changed from a punitive system to a restorative system, I guess, where rather than putting people in jail as punishment, and it's like it obviously should be punishment, but the focus shouldn't be on the punitive element of it, but on addressing and treating, why is it that you are committing crimes, and it's a more rehabilitative process. I think, a lot of things along the lines of addiction treatments and such speak really powerfully to this. I think recently there was a wave of heroin problems in the Northeast in predominantly white areas, and the kind of policy response and the public response to this issue was totally different than it's to the same issues of heroin in black communities, where in black communities it was much more punitive, much more let's get these people into jail, let's take them out of the system, they're clearly thugs, they're clearly in the wrong. Whereas in the white community, it was much more about, hey, why are these people turning to this drug? Let's get them treatment. Let's get them, prison isn't the answer here. What do we need to do other than that? And I think that in that sort of system, you do see a pretty distinct racial disparity between how it's addressed for black communities and how it's addressed for white communities.
Ben, do you want to respond to that? Or I can take us into solutions?
Yeah, if we don't mind, I'll kind of go into solution. We're already starting to talk about solutions here, and I'm not sure how to respond to that specific situation you described, different treatment between white communities with heroin problems and not. I mean, but I would say broadly, I agree with you, Nikhil, on the idea of trying to emphasize, and I think a lot of people are talking about this, trying to emphasize rehabilitative, restorative justice over punitive, or at least along with the punitive element. I think the million-dollar question is what will work, what actually programs or approaches will work, and I don't think anyone quite has the answer to that. I've seen a couple examples. One is, I think it's called the Boston Reentry Initiative, where the goal was to, as people are being released, link people up with mentors in the communities where they will be released. Maybe a person who has also come through the prison system, or simply a member of the community that they respect, they can develop rapport with. I think that has seen some success. Also, I think I've mentioned it before on this program, or I think I've talked about it before, the Ceasefire initiative. It's a violence reduction initiative that David Kennedy pioneered, and also in Boston initially, I think. And so I think that's kind of on the front end, trying to get at the question of can we stop people from preventing violent crimes in particular, and can that lead to reduced incarceration? I think those initiatives should definitely be given a lot of consideration, possible federal funding, that kind of thing. That's what I have to start with. Anything else, Nikhil, that you wanted to address, or Chris?
I think that those are all excellent, absolutely excellent suggestions, and I absolutely agree with almost all of them. I think that, maybe it's worthwhile talking about the banning the box initiative and whether or not that's a good idea. And on one hand, I think that employers definitely do have a right to know about your potential candidate's criminal record or arrest record. And that's something that you're definitely entitled to know, and you should absolutely be allowed that information. However, I do think that perhaps that's some information that should be released later on in the interview process, because when you're doing interviews or the hiring process and you have a bunch of candidates, and all you see at the beginning are the candidates who don't have the box checked off and the candidates who do have the box checked off, you're automatically almost certainly going to throw away the candidates who have the box checked off, unless you are specifically looking to try and hire prison former offenders, I guess. Whereas I think that if you have a way for that information to get conveyed later on in the application process, perhaps after the person has gone through a round of interviews or some screening or something like that, then I think that an employer would be more likely to overlook a criminal record, especially if the individual has had a chance to explain what happened, why it happened, how they've changed, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And on banning the box, which is like the box, yes, I have a criminal record when you're applying for employment. I don't have I think I would agree with you. I think it's something to look at, because again, employment is something that is important for people to be able to rebuild their lives and to be able to become contributing members of society. However, I'm with you. I don't want to necessarily say as a blanket, certainly not a federal policy, that all private institutions are barred from inquiring as to the criminal record. I think there's all kinds of, I'm just thinking if I was running a business, or if I was hiring, I would want to know that about people. So that's another one that's sort of a difficult issue. So I don't have a very firm opinion on it, although I would certainly I think states and localities ought to look at that, consider, and get buy-in from businesses. Also, perhaps there could be some kind of, I think there are businesses that go out of their way to hire convicts, ex-convicts, and I think that's a great thing. I'm not sure how it's worked. I want to see how it has worked. there also could be. I think there are some government-run programs where government funds employment for ex-convicts. I think that's something also worth considering. Again, starting at state and local level. So yeah, employment I think is an area that should be part of a sort of package of I guess solutions.
And just to address this state versus federal issue really quickly, I think that, in the ideal, I would agree with you that there should be a state or local issue. But my big problem with that right now is that I think that a lot of states, if not most states, are just pretty much not in agreement about whether or not this is even a problem in the first place. I think that, you and I clearly have a certain different perspectives, but at least we've managed to agree that there's something that's not completely right here, that there's something that's not working, and it's not, it's not moving us forward to where we want to be. But I don't think that that is a conversation that's being held or a viewpoint that's shared amongst a lot of these states. There's states that have taken away libraries in prisons. There's states that have similar types of policy proposals and policy issues. And so my concern sort of is, yes, I would love it to be a state and local issue, but if people aren't recognizing that it is an issue, I don't trust the state and local bodies to move forward on it, I guess.
Well, let me respond. I mean, I'm not sure on all the different states, but I know I'll just put up an example. Texas is kind of notorious for being tough on crime, and having, I guess, as you described, almost like a punitive approach, where death penalty is operative, and all these things. But Texas has actually been on the forefront of a lot of the criminal justice reforms that are aimed in these areas: reentry, emphasizing rehabilitation, things like that. And even there's a group here called the Texas Public Policy Foundation that has a whole wing of their operation dedicated to it, called Right on Crime. So there's sort of a conservative. Stephen Tellis has a great article on this, political science approach, about how kind of people on the right started to pioneer, particularly at the state level, initiatives related to this. So I mean, yeah, I would agree. It's state level reform and changes always takes longer, but often I think, and even I would argue that President Obama's recent emphasis on criminal justice reform actually sort of was preceded by a lot of these state level reform efforts, though. So and sometimes it's the federal government is such a massive tangle of bureaucracy and different organizations that sometimes it can be hard to make reforms there. So in a way, yeah, I agree with you that it's not going to happen all at once. Reforms don't happen all at once at the state level, but in a way that may be the kind of thing that's required to make really lasting improvements. And so that's just one point I would make.
And then I guess the last issue I sort of want to bring up, I'm sorry, Chris, if you wanted to say anything, but is this whole concept of for-profit prisons. Because I think a big issue in the mass incarceration system right now is that a lot of these prisons are run for, and I think that that's pretty problematic. They have a lot of states where these private prisons have gotten contracts that basically say, we are required to have a 90 to 100% occupancy rate, and so on and so forth. And I think that leads to a kind of abusive practices in the prison itself, where it's not super comfortable conditions, it's not super humane conditions, but then also, you have incentives for the state to basically funnel people into these prisons just to kind of keep that occupancy rate at that 90 or 100% level. And I would be interested in your take on the for-profit prison system.
Ben?
Yes, yeah. I don't have a strong take on this. I'm guessing that privatization comes as a result of overcrowding in state-run prison, mismanagement or poor management, inefficient management, and the idea is there are other things like this in healthcare as well, where the state will contract with a private entity to try and generate efficiencies because they have a profit incentive to run things more efficiently. I'm guessing that's the motivation there for private-run prison facilities and other services. A lot of times there will be services like for healthcare or others, or other elements of the prison experience that are run by private companies. Are there abuses? I don't know how often or of what character. I'm sure there are also, though, problems and abuses in state-run,
Sure.
facilities as well. So I'm not ready to say one way or the other on this. Sorry, I don't have a strong opinion on this.
So maybe if I can kind of push us into the last segment of this conversation, which is, again, we've kind of been talking about solutions, but then just with the last maybe 5 minutes, focusing more on solutions. And if I may just insert some of myself into this conversation, over the last year, I've been working in South Africa prisons, actually doing restorative justice programs. And so restorative justice is this, what Nikhil and Ben were both talking about, which is kind of a flip side to the punitive retributive justice, which dominates our current criminal justice system. The restorative approach focuses on the harm that was done by crime, focuses on the harm of the victim. The victim is at the center, and then the community as well is involved in finding alternative means of corrections. So rather than punishment, finding some kind of corrections that's related to the crime. So if you robbed a lady on the street, then sitting down with that woman, her family, or even the community, and figuring out what is a way that you can build relationships here, and find a solution that actually is a humanizing corrections. So with the idea of retributive, restorative practices, do you guys see any other openings within corrections, within the the prison experience? So we see that recidivism is extremely high. That's a worldwide problem. Are there any other ways that we can make the prison experience more restorative, more healing, more humanizing, in a way that is going to bring these offenders out of prison, maybe with more community connections, maybe with less of an emphasis on learning crime while you're in prison? Is there any way we can make the corrections process more restorative or healing?
I think a great solution would be to give every prisoner an access to a Coursera account or something along those lines. And they get some allotted time where they have very limited internet access, and they can kind of basically just use these Coursera courses or something similar to that. Where the idea is, while you're in prison, you should, if you are interested in getting yourself an education or learning about what's going on and improving your skill set, you should by all means have some opportunity to do that. Where I think a huge problem is that a lot of times you go out back into the world after being 6 years in jail, and you have no idea how to relate to the world. You have no idea what's been happening, and you find yourself completely lost, and the only thing that you can fall back upon is your old gang connections or something like that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, yes, I'm absolutely in favor of the kind of things you described, Chris, and it sounds like we should be asking you kind of what kind of response you saw, what kind of experience you had with working in the field of restorative justice on the ground, so to speak. And I would give one example. I know there's a large organization called Prison Fellowship, which is a Christian ministry that was started by, I think, Chuck Colson. And that, my understanding is they're doing very good work. I haven't seen necessarily analytical evaluations of the success rates or something like that, and I'm not even sure that's their approach. It's much more about just working with people that are interested in having a mentor, a spiritual mentor, an emotional mentor, all those types of things. I think, in a way, I guess I would say I think what a focus, a switch from the retributive to the rehabilitative and the restorative approach that you mentioned, I think it's going to take a lot of effort, not just from the state. It's not just something we can expect the state to decide that's how it's going to be. My understanding is that, there already, again, there's lots of problems in prison management and in many states, and so to expect, we just needed them to solve all the problem and create this restorative atmosphere, I think it's going to take work from outside organizations like Prison Fellowship, like churches, like other community organizations, and also perhaps those that are in, who have wealth could redirect and go into communities that don't have the kind of wealth that it takes to run something like that. So yeah, I'm very in favor of that. I would put the caveat that I haven't necessarily seen evaluations that show yes, this approach works, but I think citizens, and organizations should look into those kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, if I can speak to what I think it would take for us to turn a corner in this country towards a more restorative approach to justice, I think it's going to take a lot of groundwork, a lot of conversations like this one, to change kind of our frame of reference about how we think of crime and how we think of criminals. So I think we tend to think of criminals, painting with a broad brush here, but we think of criminals as, they're inherently broken, inherently sinful, or they're just, we kind of give up on them. They're not going to come right. And I think this is where maybe part of the racial problem comes in, is as a society, and this is obviously inserting some of my personal perspective, but I think we're very quick and we find it a little too easy to just kind of write off, broad swaths of the population. And so I think there's a big change of heart and mind to see that this problem isn't going to be solved by stripping the budgets down or just like cracking the whip even harder. 3 strikes laws, tightening this down. This is some of the language we maybe heard from Donald Trump last night. I don't know exactly what he's saying when he says I'm the law and order candidate, but that's kind of some of the things that come to my mind. So just turning that corner and seeing that if we do invest time, but also money into some of these programs, it's in order to turn that corner, in order to really implement these, we're going to have to invest more. We can't. This problem is not going to be solved by pulling out and caring less about our incarcerated citizens and that. Yeah. So I guess that's where I come from on that. I don't know if Nikhil or Ben, you want to react to that?
I absolutely agree with Chris. I think that that's a huge distinction right now, I think, between liberal and conservative perspective, where it's the perception of the person. I think that a lot of the conservative viewpoint, and Ben, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've seen and heard, it does place a lot of the blame on the individual being a thug, on the individual being kind of sociopathic or problematic. And I think that is, there are much deeper problems here, and it's not just, it's not just people who are just like incorrect, I guess, but that there's a system that's incorrect.
Yeah.
And also, if it is the people who are incorrect, then we probably need to be spending a lot more money on mental health services, and that's something that I haven't seen much support for amongst the people who do kind of claim that this is an individual responsibility issue.
So we're coming to a close here. Just one reflection I'd share at the end is, so from what I saw in South Africa, my main reflection coming away is that radical change is possible. So seeing guys who have been in the prison system for 25, 30 years, who are at the very top of prison gangs, who really haven't had the chance to sit down and be rehabilitated. And that's a South African context, but it exists to some extent in this country as well. But I think we need to do better about sharing stories about people who have changed their life. And we have to, it's kind of a counterintuitive approach to, okay, if we see a rise in crime, a rise in homicide, or some of the things we've seen in the last year, our reaction is to want to tighten down, to be tougher, to punish harder, and all those things contribute to the problem from my perspective. It's almost a counterintuitive approach, the restorative approach, and the approach is we actually have to give these people opportunities. We have to open ourselves up to trust and to potentially, making ourselves vulnerable in a sense. And from my perspective, that's actually the way that we start to build capacity in offenders and things like that. Ben, do you want to offer a closing thought and then sign us off?
Sure. Thanks for moderating, Chris. Thanks, Nikhil, for being part of this. I I would agree. I definitely think that the purely retributive approach is inadequate. I guess my thought is I would say there actually is, I think, a lot of broad support for making for focusing on reentry programs, for more effective rehabilitation approaches. I don't think that's inconsistent with the insistence on law and order, on maintaining law and order. Again, we've seen rising. We talked about this last week. We've seen rising crime rates in a lot of major cities, and that's I think a major problem that we need to consider. So I don't think it's incompatible with insisting on the maintenance of public order and public safety and everything like that. So that's, and also I do think, though, also I don't think it's inconsistent with insisting on personal responsibility that Nikhil mentioned. I definitely maintain that. I think sometimes an overemphasis on the systemic causes can lead to, in other words, part of rehabilitation is realizing that you've done something wrong. And so to insist on personal responsibility for that, I don't think is inconsistent with a rehabilitative, restorative approach. So
yeah, I'd say Ben, yeah, it's actually more evident within a restorative approach. So a restorative approach connects offenders with their victims, and in many ways that's like that can be a tougher punishment, if you will, and actually forces them to see the damage, to see the harm, and to be an active participant in healing the damage that they've done. So I completely agree with you. I think a restorative approach actually puts more of the responsibility on correcting the harm actually on the offender. So totally agree with you.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. All right, thanks, gentlemen. Have a good one.
Thanks a lot, guys. This was fun.
Appreciate it.